When history remembers December 7, 1941, it remembers the sky. It remembers the roar of aircraft engines splitting the morning air over Oahu, the screaming dive of Aichi D-3 bombers descending like birds of prey, the geysers of flame erupting from Battleship Row as torpedoes found their marks beneath the oil-slicked waters of Pearl Harbor. It remembers the 353 Japanese aircraft that transformed a peaceful Sunday morning into a cascade of fire and steel, the plumes of black smoke that rose thousands of feet into the tropical air, blotting out the sun and announcing to the world that everything had changed. History remembers the 2,403 Americans who died that morning, the USS Arizona entombed beneath the harbor's surface with 1,177 men still inside her shattered hull, the Oklahoma capsized and turtlebacked in the shallow water, the West Virginia settling into the mud as her decks burned. History remembers the chaos, the heroism, the date which would live in infamy. But history has largely forgotten what happened beneath the surface, in the cold darkness below the breaking waves, where 10 Japanese sailors operating 5 Midget submarines embarked on a mission so secret, so desperate, and so unlikely to succeed that even their own commanders expected them never to return. This is the story of those men, and especially of one among them who was never supposed to survive, whose failure became his salvation, and whose captivity transformed him into something his nation had never intended him to be, a living witness to the underwater battle that history overlooked. The planning had begun months earlier, in the windowless briefing rooms of the Imperial Japanese Navy headquarters, where admirals and strategists plotted the destruction of the American Pacific Fleet with the precision of surgeons and the coldness of executioners. The aerial assault would be spectacular, overwhelming, designed to cripple American naval power in a single devastating blow. But there was another element, a secondary strike that would unfold in the harbor's depths, invisible to the eyes above, a knife thrust into the belly while the fist struck the face. The Kō-hyōteki submarines, designated Type A in official documents but known to their crews simply as the Midget subs, were engineering marvels born of desperation and innovation. 74 feet of cramped steel tube, each vessel carried 2 men, 2 torpedoes, and enough battery power for a few hours of submerged operation. They were not designed for comfort or even for extended survival. They were designed to penetrate Pearl Harbor's defenses, slip past the anti-submarine nets and patrol boats that guarded the entrance, release their deadly cargo at point-blank range against the most valuable targets they could find, and then, if the gods smiled and fortune favored, escape to a rendezvous point where larger submarines might retrieve them. But everyone involved in the operation knew the truth that was never spoken aloud in official briefings. The Kō-hyōteki crews were not expected to return. They were expected to die, and die gloriously, taking American warships with them into the depths. The selection process had been rigorous, almost ritualistic in its intensity. The Imperial Japanese Navy did not lack for volunteers. Thousands of young officers and enlisted men had offered themselves for special duties, motivated by a complex mixture of patriotism, honor, duty, and the particular cultural framework that made self-sacrifice not merely acceptable but admirable, even beautiful. But the Midget submarine crews required specific qualities. They needed to be small enough to fit into the impossibly cramped confines of the vessels. They needed technical skill to operate the complex systems. They needed the mental fortitude to function in darkness and isolation, knowing that mechanical failure, depth charges, or simple bad luck could transform their steel cocoon into a tomb at any moment. And they needed, the selection officers noted with a careful coldness that revealed the mission's true nature, minimal family obligations. Men with wives and many children were quietly excluded. The 10 sailors finally chosen represented the best of their generation, disciplined graduates of the naval academies, young men who had trained their entire adult lives for this moment, who understood navigation and engineering and tactics, who could read charts in the dark and hold their breath when the oxygen thinned and maintain perfect silence when American destroyers passed overhead with their hydrophones sweeping the water for the telltale sounds of enemy submarines. Among those 10 men was Ensign Kazuo Sakamaki, born in Tokushima Prefecture on the island of Shikoku, a landscape of mountains and temples and ancient traditions. He had been 23 years old when selected for the operation, his face still carrying the softness of youth beneath the hardened expression he had learned to wear at the Naval Academy in Etajima. Sakamaki was not the most experienced officer in the Navy, nor the most decorated, But he possessed something the selection committee valued: an intensity of purpose, a determination that bordered on obsession, a willingness to prove himself that made him volunteer for the most dangerous assignments. When he learned he had been chosen for the Kō-hyōteki operation, he felt what he would later describe as the greatest honor of his life. He did not yet understand that he had been selected, at least in part, because he was expendable. His crewmate would be Petty Officer Kiyoshi Inagaki, a quiet man with steady hands and the technical expertise to keep the submarine's temperamental systems functioning under pressure. Together, they would operate HA-19, the fifth and final Midget submarine in the Pearl Harbor Strike Force. The journey toward that December morning had been long and strange. The 5 Midget submarines had been transported across the Pacific Ocean aboard 5 fleet submarines, massive I-class vessels that served as motherships for the smaller craft. HA-19 rode piggyback on I-24, secured to special mounting brackets on the larger submarine's deck, covered and camouflaged, a secret weapon within a secret weapon. For days they traveled submerged during daylight hours, surfacing only at night to recharge batteries and refresh air, the submarine fleet maintaining radio silence as it crept closer to the Hawaiian Islands. The men of the Midget subcrews lived in borrowed quarters aboard the mother ships, knowing that once they transferred to their tiny vessels, they would have almost no room to move, no space to exist as anything other than operators of machinery. They studied maps and charts, memorizing the contours of Pearl Harbor, the positions of the anti-submarine nets, the typical patrol routes of American destroyers. They reviewed their targeting priorities: carriers first, those floating cities whose aircraft posed the greatest threat to the Imperial fleet, then battleships, the symbols of American naval power, then cruisers and anything else that presented itself. And they reviewed, though more quietly, the rendezvous plan. After releasing their torpedoes, if they survived, if their batteries held, if they evaded the inevitable counterattack, they were to make their way west to the island of Lanai, 7 miles west of Maui, where the mother submarines would attempt to pick up. The officers explained this plan with straight faces, and the crews acknowledged it with formal bows, and everyone pretended it was a real possibility rather than a polite fiction designed to give desperate men a fragment of hope. The launch came in darkness. On the night of December 6th, moving into the early hours of December 7th, the 5 fleet submarines surfaced at their designated positions outside Pearl Harbor, approximately 10 miles from the harbor entrance. One by one, the Kō-hyōteki submarines were released from their mother ships, their crews making the difficult transfer from the spacious fleet boats to the claustrophobic confines of the Midgets through hatches barely wide enough for a man's shoulders. Sakamaki and Inagaki squeezed through the narrow opening into HA-19, their bodies immediately pressed by the oppressive intimacy of the interior. The submarine was a tube within a tube, every cubic inch devoted to machinery, weapons, or the minimal space required for 2 men to operate the controls. Battery racks lined the hull, their chemical smell sharp in the recycled air. The 2 torpedoes, each weighing nearly a ton, occupied the forward section, their presence both reassuring and terrifying. They were the submarine's reason for existence, but they were also high explosives inches from the crew's bodies. The periscope was primitive, offering only a narrow slice of the world above. The controls were basic: depth, speed, direction, with no room for error or correction. And the gyrocompass, the crucial instrument that would allow them to navigate underwater without visual reference, sat in its housing between the 2 crew positions, its gentle spinning the only thing that would keep them oriented in the absolute darkness of the deep. But when Sakamaki checked the gyrocompass as they prepared to submerge and begin their approach to Pearl Harbor, his heart froze. The instrument was malfunctioning, its readings erratic, swinging wildly without correlation to their actual heading. He tapped it gently, then less gently, hoping for a miracle of mechanical correction. Nothing. The gyrocompass was broken, had perhaps been damaged during the launch or had developed a fault during the long journey across the Pacific. Without it, navigating underwater would be nearly impossible. They would be blind in the darkness, unable to maintain a steady course, forced to surface repeatedly to take visual bearings and correct their position. A dangerous procedure that would expose them to detection. Sakamaki faced a choice that was no choice at all. He could abort the mission, signal his mother submarine, admit defeat before the battle had even begun, and live forever with the shame of having failed his duty. Or he could continue, trusting his memory of the charts, his sense of direction, his ability to compensate for the missing instrument through sheer willpower and dead reckoning. It took him less than 30 seconds to decide. They would continue. He gave Inagaki the news with a calmness he did not feel, and together they secured the hatch and began their descent into the black waters. Navigating by instinct and memory through the darkness toward one of the most heavily defended harbors in the world should have been impossible, and indeed it proved nearly so. Sakamaki surfaced repeatedly to check their position through the periscope, each exposure a risk that could bring American patrol boats screaming toward them. The hours slipped past, precious battery power draining with each course correction, and still they had not reached the harbor entrance. The attack was scheduled for 7:48 a.m., time to catch the Americans during their Sunday morning routines when the fleet would be in port and the defenses relaxed. But as dawn broke over the Pacific, HA-19 was still struggling toward its target, falling further behind schedule with each passing moment. Sakamaki could feel the mission slipping away from him, could imagine the other 4 Midget submarines already penetrating the harbor, already selecting their targets, already achieving the glory that he was failing to grasp. The shame of it burned worse than the increasing heat inside the submarine, worse than the growing headache from the recycled air, worse than the knowledge that they were probably going to die without accomplishing anything. Then, at approximately 7 a.m., as HA-19 attempted another approach to the harbor entrance, disaster struck with swift and impersonal violence. The American destroyer USS Helm, on patrol outside the harbor, spotted the submarine's periscope cutting through the water. The alarm went out immediately, and within minutes other ships converged on the position. Depth charges began falling around HA-19, the underwater explosions creating pressure waves that slammed into the submarine's hull like hammer blows from an angry god. The world became sound and fury, the metal skin of the submarine shrieking under stress, equipment rattling and breaking loose from its mountings, the lights flickering and dying as electrical systems failed. Sakamaki fought the controls, driving the submarine deeper, trying to evade the pattern of explosions that seemed to follow them wherever they turned. Inagaki worked frantically to repair damaged systems, his hands moving with practiced precision even as his face showed the terror they both felt. They had trained for this scenario, had practiced emergency procedures until they could perform them in complete darkness. But training in the safety of Japanese waters was different from the reality of being hunted in enemy territory by ships whose sole purpose was to kill them. For hours they played a desperate game of hide and seek in the waters outside Pearl Harbor, the American destroyers above methodically working their way through a search pattern, dropping depth charges whenever their hydrophones detected a suspicious sound. HA-19 would dive deep, then creep away slowly on minimal power, then hide on the bottom, then try again to approach the harbor, only to be driven off by another pattern of explosions. Through the periscope, during those brief moments when they dared raise it above the surface, Sakamaki caught glimpses of what was happening at Pearl Harbor. Even from miles away, the signs were unmistakable. Columns of black smoke rose thousands of feet into the morning sky, so dense and dark they seemed like pillars holding up the heavens. The smoke spoke of oil burning, of ships dying, of the attack proceeding exactly as planned. Without them, Sakamaki could hear the distant rumble of explosions, could see aircraft circling like schools of predatory fish, could occasionally spot the flash of anti-aircraft fire creating white bursts against the smoke-darkened sky. The attack he was supposed to be part of was happening without him, the glory he was supposed to achieve was being claimed by others, and he was trapped outside the harbor, unable to contribute, unable to fulfill his mission, slowly running out of battery power and breathable air and options. As the day wore on and the situation became increasingly desperate, Sakamaki made repeated attempts to force HA-19 through the harbor entrance, each one ending in failure as the American defenses detected them and drove them back with more depth charges. The submarine began showing signs of serious damage. The batteries were nearly exhausted, providing only enough power for brief spurts of movement. The air inside the hull had grown foul, thick with carbon dioxide and the chemical smell of leaking battery acid. Both men were suffering from carbon monoxide poisoning. Their thinking slowed, their vision blurred, their movements uncoordinated. The temperature inside the submarine had risen to unbearable levels, the tropical sun beating down on the metal hull, turning the interior into an oven. They were soaked with sweat, gasping for breath, fighting against the growing conviction that they were going to die not in glorious combat but in a slow suffocation inside a disabled submarine, having accomplished nothing. Then, late in the afternoon, HA-19 ran aground on a coral reef near Bellows Field on the eastern shore of Oahu. The impact was jarring but not catastrophic, the submarine wedging itself into the reef structure with a grinding sound that seemed to seal their fate. They were stuck, unable to back off the reef, the batteries too weak to provide the power needed to force their way free. As the tide went out, the submarine's conning tower broke the surface, making them visible from shore and sealing any chance of escape. They were trapped, immobile, exposed, and rapidly running out of time. Inside the hull, the air had become poisonous. Gases from the damaged batteries filled the confined space, a toxic mixture that burned their lungs and made every breath a labor. Inagaki began coughing violently, his body rejecting the poison it was being forced to breathe. Sakamaki felt his consciousness starting to slip, black spots appearing in his vision, his thoughts fragmenting into disconnected pieces that no longer made coherent sense. In that moment of extremity, facing certain capture or death, Sakamaki made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He would destroy the submarine and die with it, denying the Americans the prize of capturing an intact Japanese vessel. The Kō-hyōteki submarines carried scuttling charges for exactly this purpose, explosives designed to blow holes in the hull and send the vessel to the bottom before it could be captured. Sakamaki and Inagaki, working with the last of their strength, set the charges with trembling hands and prepared to die. But mechanical failure, which had plagued them throughout the entire operation, struck one final time. The scuttling charges failed to detonate. The submarine remained stubbornly intact, refusing to sink, refusing to explode, refusing to grant them even the dignity of a warrior's death. They tried again, checking connections, resetting fuses, but nothing worked. The submarine that had failed them in every other way now failed to destroy itself, leaving them with only one option: abandonment. They decided to swim for shore under cover of darkness, planning to either find a way to rejoin Japanese forces or die trying. As night fell and the tide began to rise, they opened the hatch and emerged into the tropical air, gasping at the sweetness of clean oxygen after hours breathing poison. The shore was visible as a dark line against the stars, perhaps 200 yards away. It should have been an easy swim for trained Navy men, but they were weakened by exhaustion, poisoning, and the psychological trauma of their failed mission. They slipped into the water, the warm Pacific closing over their heads, and began swimming toward Oahu. Sakamaki, his consciousness fading in and out, lost contact with Inagaki almost immediately. He called out into the darkness but heard no response. Somewhere in that short swim between the reef and the shore, Kiyoshi Inagaki, the quiet petty officer with steady hands and technical expertise, drowned or succumbed to the gases still in his lungs or simply gave up and let the sea take him. Sakamaki would never know. He only knew that when he dragged himself onto the beach at Bellows Field, he was alone. He did not make it far. The combination of carbon monoxide poisoning, exhaustion, and despair overwhelmed him, and he collapsed on the sand, unconscious, half in and half out of the water. When he woke, it was to find himself staring up at the barrel of a pistol held by Sergeant David Akui of the 298th Infantry Regiment, Hawaii National Guard. Akui, on beach patrol duty, had found the unconscious Japanese officer, and his first instinct had been to shoot. But something, perhaps curiosity, perhaps mercy, perhaps simply the training that said prisoners were more valuable than corpses, made him hesitate. Sakamaki, barely conscious, speaking no English, understood only that he had been captured. He had become the first Japanese prisoner of war taken by American forces in World War II, a distinction that filled him with a shame so profound it was almost physical, a weight pressing on his chest that made breathing difficult. In the days that followed, as he was questioned by American intelligence officers through translators, Sakamaki begged repeatedly to be killed. Death, he explained with the earnestness of a true believer, was preferable to the dishonor of capture. A Japanese officer was supposed to die rather than surrender. He had failed his mission, lost his crewmate, allowed his submarine to be captured intact, and now lived as a prisoner, every element a violation of the code he had been raised to honor. The Americans found his requests disturbing and fascinating in equal measure, a window into a warrior culture they were only beginning to understand. They denied his requests, of course, and instead processed him as a prisoner of war, photographed him, questioned him about Japanese plans and capabilities, and eventually transported him to a POW camp on the mainland United States. WW2, meanwhile, began its own strange journey. The submarine was recovered from the Reef, studied exhaustively by American naval engineers who marveled at its compact design and technical sophistication, and then repurposed as a propaganda tool. Throughout 1942 and 1943, the captured Midget submarine was transported across the United States on a war bond tour, displayed in city after city as a trophy of American victory and a symbol of the enemy's perfidy. Millions of Americans paid to see the submarine that had attacked Pearl Harbor, to touch its hull, to peer through its hatches and imagine the claustrophobic hell of operating such a vessel. The submarine that was supposed to die in glory instead became a circus attraction, its existence proof that at least some element of the Japanese attack had failed. WW2 raised millions of dollars for the war effort and became one of the most photographed objects of the war years, its image appearing on posters and newsreels and magazine covers. The instrument of Sakamaki's failure had become, paradoxically, one of the most famous submarines in the world. Sakamaki, meanwhile, disappeared into the anonymous world of prisoner-of-war camps. He was initially held in isolation, considered both a valuable intelligence source and a potential security risk. But as the war progressed and more Japanese prisoners were taken, though never many, as Japanese military culture strongly discouraged surrender, he was moved into general population camps where he encountered other captives. The experience was transformative in ways he never anticipated. Separated from the intense cultural pressure of Japanese military society, living day after day with nothing to do but think and talk, and try to maintain sanity in captivity, Sakamaki began a process of psychological transformation. He learned English slowly and painfully, starting with basic words and gradually building vocabulary through conversation with guards and other prisoners who had been captured earlier and had more experience with the language. He read American books and magazines, trying to understand the enemy that had become his jailer. He talked with other prisoners about the war, about Japan, about what they were fighting for and whether it was worth the cost. Depression came in waves, sometimes overwhelming him for days or weeks at a time. He would lie on his bunk in the barracks, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events of December 7th in his mind, searching for the moment when everything went wrong, the decision that might have changed the outcome if he had chosen differently. He wondered constantly about Inagaki, whether his crewmate had suffered in those final moments, whether he had died cursing Sakamaki for leading them into disaster. He wondered about the other 9 men from the Midget submarine cruise, whether any of them had survived, whether any had achieved the glory that had eluded him. He felt like a ghost, a man who should have died but didn't, living in a half-existence that neither Japanese nor American culture knew how to categorize. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, something shifted inside him. He began to emerge from depression, not into happiness but into a kind of quiet acceptance. He started participating in camp activities, helping to organize work details and recreational programs. Other prisoners began to look to him for leadership, respecting his officer status and his growing command of English. He mediated disputes between prisoners, negotiated with camp authorities for better conditions, tried to maintain some semblance of dignity and routine in a situation designed to strip both away. And somewhere in that process of living day after day in captivity, of being forced to see Americans as individual human beings rather than abstract enemies, of having time to think beyond the immediate demands of military duty, Sakamaki began to question the beliefs that had brought him to Pearl Harbor. The war ended in August 1945 with Japan's surrender following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Sakamaki, along with the other Japanese POWs held in American camps, was processed for repatriation. The journey home was strange and dreamlike, sailing back across the Pacific toward a Japan he had not seen in 4 years, a Japan that had been transformed by defeat in ways he could barely imagine. When he finally stepped off the ship onto Japanese soil in late 1945, he felt like a man returning from the dead, a ghost walking among the living. Japan did not know what to make of him. He was simultaneously a war veteran and a prisoner, a participant in the Pearl Harbor attack and a symbol of failure, a man who should have died but lived. The militaristic culture that had sent him to war had been destroyed along with Japan's armies and cities, replaced by American occupation and enforced democratization. Everything had changed. Sakamaki struggled to reintegrate into civilian life. He found work at a Toyota dealership, a mundane existence that seemed impossible to reconcile with his previous life as a naval officer. He married, had children, tried to build something normal out of the ruins of his past. But he carried Pearl Harbor with him always, a weight that never fully lifted. In the decades that followed, he became an outspoken pacifist, writing and speaking about his experiences, arguing against militarism and war with the fervor of a convert. He published a memoir that detailed his Pearl Harbor mission and his years in captivity, one of the few first-hand accounts from a Japanese participant in the attack. He spent the rest of his life trying to answer an impossible question: what did it mean to survive what you were supposed to die from, to become a symbol of failure that paradoxically gave you the gift of life? The story of the 5 Midget submarines at Pearl Harbor remained incomplete, full of gaps and mysteries that historians continue to debate. Of the 10 crew members, only Sakamaki survived. The fate of the other 4 submarines was gradually pieced together through American records, Japanese archives, and underwater archaeology. One submarine, HA-16, was sunk by the destroyer USS Monaghan inside the harbor during the attack, its crew dying as planned, taking no American ships with them. Another was found years later on the ocean floor outside the harbor, its crew's fate unknown but presumed dead from depth charge attacks or mechanical failure. A third was discovered decades later in the waters near Pearl Harbor, its hull torn open, its crew's bones still inside. The 4th submarine's fate remained unknown until 1960, when it was finally located and identified. Not one of the 5 submarines had successfully torpedoed an American ship, despite their crew's dedication and sacrifice. The entire operation, conceived in secret and executed with determination, had failed completely in its tactical objectives. But the mystery went deeper than those 5 submarines. The Japanese Navy had developed nearly 50 Midget submarines by the war's end, deploying them at locations throughout the Pacific, Sydney Harbor, Diego Garcia, Guadalcanal, and others. Some of these operations were documented, but others remained shrouded in speculation and incomplete records. At Pearl Harbor itself, some historians have argued that Midget submarine torpedoes may have struck American ships despite the apparent failure of all 5 submarines, citing unexplained torpedo damage and the testimony of sailors who reported seeing torpedo wakes from unexpected directions during the attack. The debate continues, fueled by incomplete records, partisan interpretations, and the simple fact that the chaos of battle makes definitive answers impossible. The underwater battle at Pearl Harbor remains, in many ways, as murky as the waters in which it was fought. Kazuo Sakamaki died in 1999 at the age of 81, having lived more than 5 decades beyond his intended death at Pearl Harbor. In his later years, he returned to Hawaii several times, visiting Pearl Harbor as a tourist rather than an attacker, standing on the memorial built above the sunken Arizona and paying respects to the men who died there. He met with American veterans of the attack, awkward encounters that gradually warmed into something approaching understanding if not quite friendship. He tried to apologize not for fighting nations fight wars and soldiers fight for their nations, but for the hatred and militarism that made the war inevitable. He tried to explain what it was like to be 23 years old and certain that dying gloriously was the highest achievement possible, and then to spend the rest of your life learning that living thoughtfully might be more valuable than dying spectacularly. The legacy of December 7, 1941 is complicated, layered with meaning that shifts depending on perspective and time. For Americans, it remains the day of infamy, the surprise attack that drew the United States into World War II, the catalyst for 4 years of global conflict that reshaped the world order. For Japanese, it represents both the apex of imperial military power and the beginning of a catastrophic war that ended in nuclear fire and absolute defeat. But for Kazuo Sakamaki, Pearl Harbor was something more personal and strange. The day he was supposed to die but didn't, the day his failure saved his life, the day he became a symbol of something he never intended to represent. He was the man who survived the suicide mission, the prisoner who became a pacifist, the failed warrior who lived long enough to question everything he had been taught to believe. Ch. 19. the submarine that betrayed him with its malfunctioning gyrocompass and refused to sink when he tried to scuttle it, outlived him. After its war bond tour, the submarine was donated to the National Museum of the Pacific War in Texas, where it remains on display to this day, its hull painted and preserved, its interior cleaned and made safe for tourists. Visitors can walk around it, can try to imagine what it was like to operate such a vessel, can take selfies next to the torpedoes and marvel at the cramped space. The submarine has become an object, a historical artifact divorced from the terror and desperation and human cost of the story it represents. Few of the tourists who see it know Sakamaki's name or understand that the vessel before them was supposed to be a tomb, that it failed its mission in every conceivable way, and that this failure paradoxically gave one man the unwanted gift of survival. The underwater battle at Pearl Harbor remains the forgotten element of that infamous day, overshadowed by the dramatic aerial assault, relegated to footnotes in histories that focus on the bombers and torpedo planes and the burning battleships. The 10 men who climbed into those tiny submarines knowing they would probably die have been largely erased from popular memory, remembered if at all as curiosities, as minor characters in a story dominated by larger forces and more spectacular violence. But their story of determination and duty, of mechanical failure and human fragility, of the strange intersection of technology and courage and luck, deserves to be told and remembered. It reveals something fundamental about war, about how even the most carefully planned operations can fail in unexpected ways, how human beings respond to impossible situations, how the difference between death and survival can come down to a malfunctioning instrument or a failed explosive charge or simply the fortune of washing up on shore where someone decides not to shoot you. Sakamaki's life after Pearl Harbor became a different kind of mission, one he never trained for and never expected. He became a witness, a storyteller, a man trying to make sense of his survival by sharing what he learned from it. He spoke to school groups and peace organizations, wrote articles and gave interviews, tried to explain to new generations what it was like to believe so completely in dying that living became unbearable. He argued that the same determination and discipline that made young men willing to die in submarines could be redirected toward building peace, that courage did not require violence, that sacrifice could take forms other than self-destruction. He was not always eloquent and his message was not always welcomed. There were plenty in Japan who saw him as a traitor to the old values, and plenty outside Japan who saw him as trying to rehabilitate a morally indefensible cause. But he persisted, driven by the same intensity of purpose that had made him volunteer for the Midget submarine operation decades earlier, except now the mission was not destruction but understanding. The waters off Pearl Harbor still hold secrets. Despite decades of underwater exploration and archaeology, mysteries remain. Debris fields that might be from Midget submarines lie in the deep water outside the harbor, some investigated, others too deep or too degraded to definitively identify. Unexplained torpedo damage on American ships suggests impacts that don't match the known tracks of aerial torpedoes, hinting that perhaps one of the Midget submarines did find its target after all, accomplishing something before being destroyed. Japanese records are incomplete, sometimes contradictory, leaving gaps that speculation rushes to fill. The families of the 9 dead crew members never received their bodies, never had graves to visit, left only with the official pronouncement that their sons and husbands and brothers had died gloriously in service to the emperor. For them, the underwater battle at Pearl Harbor never really ended. It remained an open wound, a loss without closure, a sacrifice whose meaning shifted with Japan's transformation from militaristic empire to pacifist democracy. The story resonates because it operates on multiple levels simultaneously. On the tactical level, it is a study in military failure, a textbook example of how even highly trained forces with sophisticated equipment can fail when luck turns against them and mechanical systems don't perform as designed. On the human level, it is a story about extreme situations and how people respond when everything goes wrong, when duty conflicts with survival, when the codes you have been taught to live by no longer seem to make sense. On the historical level, it reveals the complexity of World War II beyond the grand narratives of good versus evil, showing individual human beings trapped in systems larger than themselves, making impossible choices with imperfect information under unbearable pressure. And on the existential level, it asks profound questions about meaning and purpose, about what happens when your intended death doesn't occur, about how identity persists when everything else has changed. Kazuo Sakamaki never stopped being haunted by December 7, 1941, But over the decades, the haunting changed character. In the beginning, it was shame, a crushing weight of failure and dishonor that made him wish for death. Later, it became something more complex: grief for lost comrades, anger at the militaristic system that had sent them on an impossible mission, confusion about his own survival and what it meant. And finally, in his later years, it became a kind of somber wisdom, an understanding that his failure had given him something precious: time. Time to think, to change, to become something other than what he had been trained to be. Time to raise children and grow old and see the world transform. Time to learn that surviving what you were supposed to die for might be its own form of victory, strange and uncomfortable and unintended, but real nonetheless. The 5 Midget submarines at Pearl Harbor, those 74-foot steel tubes operated by 10 brave and doomed men, disappeared into history's depths, remembered imperfectly if at all. But their story persists, carried forward by the lone survivor who spent the rest of his long life trying to explain what happened beneath the waves on that infamous morning when the world changed. Sakamaki became the voice for the silent dead, the witness to the forgotten battle, the living reminder that even in war's most carefully orchestrated moments, chaos and chance and human error can transform intended tragedy into unexpected survival. His legacy is not the glory he sought, but something stranger and more valuable: the testimony of a man who was supposed to be a symbol of self-sacrifice but became instead a symbol of life's stubborn persistence, of how even in war's darkest moments, the future remains unwritten and survival, however shameful it may initially seem, creates possibilities that death forecloses forever.